Well, welcome back to the program. I'm Isaac Crockett, and a reoccurring friend of our special guest, attorney David New, is with us. And David, you brought up a very important document that goes all the way back to the beginning of the presidency of President John F. Kennedy back in 1961. The State Department of the United States published, it was actually given to the United Nations in 1961, then published for public viewing, the Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. And it basically outlines what needs to be done to have a one world governing body that gives us peace. And we're talking today about peace, but there is no peace, going back to Patrick Henry, a speech he gave in Virginia in 1775, and he's actually quoting the prophet Jeremiah of the Old Testament. But in this document, David, that you've brought our attention to, the State Department puts this little information on it. It says, please note that this is basically saying it's an exact reproduction of the State Department publication 7277, but it says, we believe this document to be entirely too important to be allowed to remain out of print. So they wanted to bring it back into print, make it available. They want the public to see this. This is the sort of information that's been fed into our education systems, into our media, into kind of the black hole that we often refer to as the deep state. So, David, could you kind of talk us through this then, kind of outlines 3 different steps that need to happen for us to basically get rid of all the constitutional stuff that you were just talking about and to somehow become controlled by the United Nations and have them bring us true peace according to this document?
Yes, and as I say, ladies and gentlemen, you can get a free copy of this document on the Internet, and it's only 24 pages long. When you study Bible prophecy and you study the book of Revelation, chapter 13, this is an excellent document to include in your Bible class. Now, that brief note that you were referring to, that actually is an addition. That's the only part of this document that is not part of the original publication. This particular group is making sure that this document doesn't get lost in history. And so where it says, please note, and then on the bottom it talks about the name of the organization, they are reproducing it so that it's easier for the public to get a hold of it. Outside of those 2 paragraphs on this page 3 here, everything is U.S. government printed. And as I said before, ladies and gentlemen, to implement this document that our government is doing, you basically have to undo the Constitution. Because this document, and it point blank says it, where it talks about the total, here I'll read it verbatim, bullet. It says, the disbanding of all national armed forces and the prohibition of their reestablishment in any form whatsoever other than those required to preserve internal order and for the contribution to United Nations peace force. Now notice it says the disbanding of all national armed forces. That means our Army and our Navy, our Air Force disappear. And that means that the United Nations at that point becomes the world government. This is world government. And the exact phrases that makes this unconstitutional are, 1, in the preamble, where it says provide for the common defense. Also in Article 1, Section 8, where Congress has the power to, quote-unquote, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a Navy. That's in Article 1, Section 8. This all has to be eliminated to make this disbanding possible. Then again, in Article 2, Section 2, it says, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. For that to no longer be true, you've got to eliminate the Constitution. So when it says the disbanding of all national armed forces, that means Article 2, Section 2, the President of the United States is no longer the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States. It now goes to the United Nations.
And David, what you're reading to us, this did not come from the United Nations being handed down to us. This came from our own United States States Department, right?
Absolutely. This is published by the United States Government Printing Office, and it's their plan for world government. Now, let's talk about the 3 stages that is involved here. Stage number 1, what was to happen there is that the military forces of the United States and the Soviet Union are to be reduced to 2.1 million people. That's the first stage. So, the United States and the Soviet Union are also to reduce their nuclear armaments. That's on page 5. So if you go to page 5 and talk about the first stage, so we each get 2.1 million troops in the military. And then we have to start reducing our nuclear weapons. Then on page 8, now is the second stage. And it says, we're allowed 2.1 million in the first stage, but now in the second stage, it says, quote unquote, reading from the document, further substantial reductions in the armed forces armaments and the military establishment of states, including strategic nuclear weapons delivery vehicles and countering weapons. So now in the second stage, we go from 2.1 million in the United States military, and we now have to make further substantial reductions. And of course, when you move from stage 1 to stage 2, how do you know when stage 2 begins? When both the United States and the Soviet Union and the other governments of the world have enough confidence that everybody is doing it. Then comes the third stage. And this is the kicker. The third stage is on page 9. And this is what it says. Quote unquote, during the third stage of the program, the states of the world, building on the experience and confidence gained in successfully implementing the measures of the first 2 stages, would take the final steps towards the goal of a world in which, here's the first bullet, states would retain only those forces, non-nuclear armaments, and establishments required for the purpose of maintaining internal order. In other words, we can have a police force. They would also support and provide agreed manpower for a UN peace force. What is that saying? That is saying in the third stage, there is no more United States Army. There's no more United States Marine Corps. There's no more United States Navy. There's no more United States Air Force. The only thing the United States is allowed to have is enough military or enough force for internal order. In other words, we would be allowed to have a police force, and that's it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but this is absolutely frightening.
It is frightening, not only because it's coming from, the high levels of our government, the State Department, but because they felt brazen enough then to present it publicly to the nations at the United Nations, and that they had it so well thought through. They're not just saying, here's a suggestion. They clearly have many people who want to see this. I mean, this is their goal, and it has been their goal, then we see now, since really early stages of, would that be early stages of the Cold War, that this has been a top priority for the deep state?
Although it's not in this form, this type of behavior, this type of thinking, not only goes back to 1945 when the UN was created, but it goes back to the League of Nations, which was one of the reasons why the United States would not ratify and join the League of Nations. They, at that time, during the Wilson administration, were not willing to join up in such an organization because it eventually leads to the surrender of the sovereignty of the people of the United States. We have to lose our constitutional rights in order for this thing to happen.
and it's scary. Now, I'd just like to get your opinion. So you pointed out it's clearly unconstitutional. On just a very practical level, do you think it's even practically possible, or what do you think? Possibility of it happening?
Well, let's talk about it this way. Supposing you don't believe in the Bible. Supposing you don't believe that the destiny of human life on this planet is in the hands of God. That God is not the future. That man decides his future all on his own. There is no God. If you have that view, then you look at all these nuclear weapons and chemical and biological weapons. What is your solution? How does the human species survive? From the natural man's point of view, world government is the only solution possible. That's why these people are doing it. They basically are throwing God out and dethroning God, and they're saying, we decide our future and we need world government if we as a human species are to survive.
That's logical. That's very logical, but it's also very frightening.